We are currently experiencing one of the most challenging periods in the history of the United States, with the confluence of a pandemic, economic collapse, and now social unrest. Now, we have previously experienced each of these traumas in our history. We had a pandemic in 1918 with the Spanish influenza. We had an economic depression in the 1930s. And unfortunately, we have had social unrest at various times in our history. But never have we had to deal with all three of these upheavals at the same time as we do now. Now, it's been a little over a week since the brutal killing of George Floyd. The video footage from Minneapolis shows an actual homicide with unmistakable clarity and unconscionable cruelty, possibly racially motivated. It has sparked a nationwide protest against police brutality and racial injustice. But while much of that protest has been peaceful, it has also resulted in violence, as well as the burning of property and the looting of stores. Now, protest by definition is a challenge to the status quo. It represents a threat to the conventional order. But the most important reforms in American life have come about through protests against established practices. Through protest, we got the abolition of slavery. Protest has resulted in women's rights, in voting rights, and in improved working conditions. Now, the right to protest is guaranteed to all Americans based on the right to petition the government for redress of grievances without fear of punishment or reprisals. That is the essence of the First Amendment, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Protest movements have been part of American history from the very beginning. In fact, you could say that the American nation was born out of protest. So in this brief lecture, I hope to give you an overview of the history of protest in America and some of the reforms that have resulted from protest movements. And also, I'd like to examine why this moment of protest seems to be more intense than many previous protests. If we go back in history, British law protected the right to protest, dating back to the Magna Carta of 1215. The Petition of Right in 1628 also included the right to protest in Great Britain, as did the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Now, colonists were British citizens, and so they exercised the right to petition local assemblies in colonial America. Between 1763 and 1775, American colonists protested a series of parliamentary laws that were intended to tighten Britain's control over the colonies. The first of these laws was the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonists from migrating west of the Appalachian Mountains. Here you see the chain of the Appalachian Mountains, and so colonists were confined to the area that you see in red. Now, this area in pink was controlled by Britain, but Great Britain did not want colonists to go past this line because if they did, they would become involved in conflict with Native Americans, and then the British would have to send troops to protect the colonists, and that's something that Britain wanted to avoid. But colonists were very upset about the Proclamation of 1763. They wanted the right to expand westward. And so white settlers continued to swarm across the Appalachian Mountains as a form of protest. In 1765, Parliament enacted the Stamp Act, insisting on the right to tax the colonies without the consent of the colonists. And so the Sons of Liberty focused their rage on the stamp collectors, the agents of the British Crown. They tarred and feathered them, as you see in this depiction. And as a result, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. 5 years later, on March 5th, 1770, people in Boston gathered to protest the stationing of British soldiers there when they were fired upon, and that became known as the Boston Massacre, leaving 5 people dead. And in 1773, when Parliament insisted that Americans pay a tax on tea, colonial protesters boarded ships and dumped the tea into the harbor in what has become known as the Boston Tea Party, perhaps the most famous form of protest in colonial America. So this series of colonial protests and British retaliation ultimately led colonists to declare independence from Great Britain in 1776. Now, the Declaration of Independence itself is a manifesto of protests. It highlights at least 26 specific instances in which the British Crown abused the rights of the American colonists. And so the American nation was born out of protests. And it was protests that directly led to the writing of the Constitution. The first form of government that arose after independence was called the Articles of Confederation. And it called for a very weak central government. Farmers in Western Massachusetts were losing their farms to creditors, and in 1786 they rose up in rebellion, a rebellion led by Daniel SHAY'S, which has become known as SHAY'S Rebellion. And it sent shockwaves across the nation. With no national police force, people feared that this rebellion would lead to further widespread rebellion in the new American nation. And so it was this series of crisis and doom that convinced many people that the government under the Articles of Confederation should be revised. And so a constitutional convention met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 in order to revise the existing form of government. And what they came up with was a constitution that explicitly protected a citizen's right to protest. Our fundamental right to protest receives protection from all 5 clauses of the First Amendment. So, for example, protest is part of our freedom of speech. We have the right to speak out against things that we feel need to be changed. The right of the people to peaceably assemble is inherent in the right to protest, and our right to petition the government for a redress of grievances is all part of our right to protest. Now, for some groups,